Gangs and juveniles. We're going to look at some of the issues and answers to juveniles and gang problems for today in the retail environment. Security officers face an increasing problem with the congregation of juveniles with gang activities in and around retail properties. We're going to talk about some of the things that we can do as security officers to best serve our merchants, our patrons, and our property owners.
Gentlemen, you need to do some shopping.
I know, we're paying for his sister. That's the only ride home.
I'm waiting for my sister.
You need to be walking around. You need to catch the bench, sit down, but don't hang out on the rails.
We sit at the bench and wait?
There's a bench right there.
All right.
16 code 4.
When we talk about juveniles, it's necessary for purposes of this discussion to define what we mean by that term. Juveniles, we will assume to be those persons who are not accompanied by their parents and who are young enough to yet engage in juvenile type behavior. Some acts committed that are juvenile in character are done by legal adults. For purposes of this discussion, we will consider those persons in this group as well. It's first necessary to remember that, first of all, juveniles are mall patrons. And as patrons, they are entitled to the same kind of consideration and courtesy as all other mall patrons. Juveniles, however, should conform their behavior to mall rules and regulations. And it's well to keep in mind that some behaviors that would be permissible by juveniles in another setting may not be permissible by mall rules. For example, it might be perfectly all right to loiter and visit and socialize in a school corridor, whereas in a mall corridor, it would be prohibited behavior. Please keep in mind that in all compliance activity on the part of security officers, there are three priorities that we must keep firmly in mind. The first priority is to protect persons, the second priority is to protect property, and the third priority is to enforce mall rules. It's also necessary and well to keep in mind that security officers who venture into the territory of compliance activity in relation to juvenile behavior might very well be subjected to abusive behavior.
We don't play games here. Start walking. Start walking now.
Okay.
513 east of QZR 11 East Region route.
Ain't that a bitch?
It is.
Ain't that a bitch?
You like to play around?
I wasn't playing, I was just talking to him.
With your middle finger?
It was this finger, guys.
Start walking.
It's not unusual at all, and perhaps many of you have experienced asking juveniles to comply and being told in sometimes profane terms that you can't do that. You might hear arguments about mall property being public property, and they behave like that elsewhere, and so they should be permitted to do that here. Please keep in mind that the professional character of security operations requires that the officer never, ever reply in kind. An abusive conversation on the part of the juvenile might prompt compliance activity of another type, but certainly is not the cause for an officer to react with the same type of language, or if physical confrontation should unfortunately result, only enough force should be used by the officer to overcome whatever resistance or whatever assault he may suffer. Please keep in mind, as with all compliance activity, there is a continuum of compliance that we talk about frequently. The first element of that is simply the presence of the officer. It is well if juvenile compliance can be gained simply through the presence of the security officer. If that has failed, then a polite request would be next. If that fails, then the security officer would ask the offending individuals, whether they're juvenile or adult, to leave. If that is refused, then police would be summoned, because the act of refusing to leave upon request constitutes the act of criminal trespass.
If you come back again, you'll be arrested for trespassing.
If we come back again,
Goodbye.
again. You'll be
You
arrested.
can't come
for
back tomorrow?
trespassing.
You can come back tomorrow. Do not come back today. You will be arrested for trespassing. Goodbye.
All right. Tell you what, here's the rules
We'll see
tomorrow.
you
When
tomorrow.
you come back tomorrow, make sure you follow them.
2910
Then you may be
514
maybe
We
you'll
have
be
2
able to
more
stay.
for these guys because
2910 514
all right, show this fine mall, man.
Cool.
I'm gonna see your ass.
Officers should be very cognizant of mall rules and regulations, especially in juvenile compliance activity. Please keep in mind that what may be permissible in another setting may be against mall rules. In order to say for sure what behavior is and what behavior is not in compliance, the security officer needs to be firmly grounded in what the procedure actually is. A security officer who is unaware of procedure could find himself in some hot water fairly quickly. Before we discuss our subject matter in great detail, let's hear what a West Coast security manager has to say about juveniles and gangs.
Basically, there are juveniles in this mall every day. A portion of them are active gang members. We have well over 30 active gangs of various ethnic groups in the immediate shopping area. We don't have a lot of problem with them because we recognize them. The ones that frequent the mall regularly know the rules. They are not allowed to fly colors. If we do see colors or tags of any sort, our first approach is to ask them to cover or remove it. If they refuse, they're asked to leave the mall. And most of the time they do comply. If they do not comply, and then we expel them based on our code of conduct, which is posted at the mall entrance. And one of the things it states is wearing colors or clothing that provokes anybody else is prohibited.
Get on the ground. Get on the ground. Get your hand behind your back. Get your hand behind your back.
location on this. You only give me
Put your hand behind your fucking back.
Upper Grand Court. Upper Grand Court.
Up on your
All units 415 physical. Upper Grand Court.
Come here. Where are you going?
Well, fortunately, most of the officers come from the immediate neighborhood. They're familiar with the patterns of the juveniles. They're familiar with the gangs, mode of dress of the juveniles. But they are given initially on the program, once they learn them all procedures and everything, they're assigned with an FTO to actually patrol with that FTO, do pedestrian stops when necessary, do customer service oriented things as necessary. So they get a broad spectrum of all the things that happen. And they in turn are able to recognize problem areas and problem juveniles.
Going out of Upper Mason's Court 60, you got primary on this.
I think our approach based on the demographics and based on the customers, the large amount of juveniles we have here, as we're proactive but not aggressive. It's a fine line. I field very few complaints, and when I do, I investigate them to see if we are being too proactive. So there's a fine line to recognize when a juvenile is a troubled juvenile or just looks like a troubled juvenile, to recognize a gang member and recognize that gang members do shop, and shop a lot. It just monitoring the behavior and yet have a high presence, a perception of visibility, and that calms any potential bad situations there. I think that's probably the single biggest thing I try to stress with my department is to be visible, recognizable, and be there. And that in itself probably stops many potential problems.
That was some very interesting information about gangs on the West Coast. Let's talk about for a minute the definition of what a gang is. Gangs come in all sizes and in all locales, and they're defined in various ways. So that you and I can have a common understanding of what gangs are, let's call them a group who affiliates together. This affiliation may be in a formal structure, it may be in a loose-knit association of people, or it could be that it has levels of hierarchy that go from the soldier all the way up to a chieftain. Gangs can be very complicated structures. Gangs can have some very strict rules for compliance. But for our purposes, we will say that they are an affiliation of people who join together for the purpose of gaining status. Some gang members lack definition in their lives. They lack a sense of identity. Gang membership can provide that status. It's a way of saying that I am someone. Also, gang members tend to affiliate with each other for mutual protection. It's a I'll protect you, you protect me kind of thing. For some, the identification with a family that they never had. It's a way of assuring that they are not alone in the world when they face danger or hardship.
Okay, this is one of our famous groups that come in through the mall. SJ X4, it stands for San Jose. X4 is 14th Street. They usually fly, their colors are red. They tag 14 XIV, which is Roman numeral for 14. I guess it's just from the 14th Street. Like I said, they claim red. They fly the colors red, whether it be red, maroon, red, cherry red, blood red.
Another purpose or another conduct of gang activity is to exclude others from a particular location. A location that a gang considers that belongs to them is usually called a turf. That's the area that they call their own. Usually gang clashes result from conflicts about territory. Gangs are very territorial. Gang members tend to identify themselves in particular ways. The clothing that they wear sometimes has a specific purpose for that day. For example, a gang member who is engaging in a particular type of activity might have prearranged to wear a particular armband or to wear his clothing in a way that's not ordinary. Those are for the purposes of specific activities on a given day. Other gangs wear colors that may range from multicolored bandanas, a specifically colored bandana, to other clothing that has some marking on it that is identifiable, at least to the gang members, as belonging to them. Sometimes the gang affiliation is written in plain English, and in other times you've got to know the code. You can't tell which gang is which unless you know how it operates.
You don't need to whistle in the mall, okay? I heard you whistling loud. All right.
Remember I told you to
You guys
cut it out, they'll screw
okay?
us over in here.
Code 4. You guys be cool, all right?
Yeah, we just
Try to break up the group. Trying to hang out on the rails.
Split up into groups of 3.
That's good. All right. He knows it. All right. The 14th XIV Northaniel gangs come in, and usually when they whistle out loud, that's a call for another gang, like a challenge to another gang, and it's usually to the Sedaniels, the 13th, which they claim is blue. So when we have groups coming in here whistling, we usually advise them not to do it, because they know why they do it, and we know why, but they kind of play the ignorant role, saying, oh no, I'm just calling my friends, but we kind of know what it is. It's a call for another gang to come up, step up to them or whatever.
You have to keep in mind that gangs are a multiracial characteristic. Gangs are not unique to any particular ethnic group. Gangs do not have, in all cases, an exclusive kind of ethnic person in that group. It may be that they include various ethnic groups in the same gang. Others are very race specific or very national origin specific. They are very careful to have people as much like themselves as they possibly can have. Some gangs have chapters that are branched out into other locations, other cities. There are gangs on the West Coast that now have East Coast chapters. Gangs seem to be a growing phenomenon. Gangs seem to be more and more in evidence. More and more major metropolitan areas are now experiencing gangs than ever before. And certainly because of the prominence of gangs, properties that have retail establishments that we must protect are certainly not immune from gangs.
I'm just going to ask them to leave, let him do his job, all right?
You don't interfere with what he's doing.
Unless property rules and regulations say to the contrary, ordinarily gang members would be treated just as anyone else. They would be judged by their behavior and not by any affiliation that they might have. In some instances, the prominence of gangs is so much that it is necessary to have a banning or a barring of gang colors to be worn in the mall. Some locales have found that those are signals for violent activity. Unless there are such specifically enumerated rules and regulations, gang members should certainly be treated as everyone else. But gang members should not be treated with any exempt enforcement or compliance activity, but as everyone else. A key to managing local gangs, the gang problems in malls, certainly involves, as much as anything else, the involvement of local law enforcement. The local police in major cities usually have gang task forces or gang activities or gang enforcement activities that they would be willing to share with a security manager and with security officers. Gang activity are recognized by law enforcement officials as being something that is a community problem. Usually law enforcement is appreciative of security efforts to open two-way channels of communication so that what law enforcement knows and can legitimately reveal, they will supply to security. It may very well be that local law enforcement officials would be very interested to know about gang activity that is observed in the mall. But please keep in mind that to accurately convey gang information, it is certainly necessary that security officers be informed about what gangs actually are, how they behave, how they dress, and about how they mark their territory. Some juveniles, some younger members of the community are called wannabes. They're not actually gang members. They don't actually have the same motivations, frequently not the same kinds of behavior, certainly not in any organized way. These persons are called usually wannabes in the vernacular. It simply means that they identify with older persons who are members of gangs, and it provides for them the same kind of identification and affiliation that it serves for the older gang member. When graffiti is encountered on a shopping center property or on a mall property, it should be photographed. The photographs may be of interest to local law enforcement officials and may serve as an identifier of who placed it there. Law enforcement should be requested to investigate the graffiti placement and, if necessary, prosecute those who placed it there. After the photograph is taken and carefully preserved to turn over to law enforcement, the graffiti should be instantly removed, because the removal of the graffiti actually defeats the purpose of it having been placed there. It is used to mark turf, please remember. And if the turf is no longer marked, then the graffiti placer gets discouraged, and hopefully graffiti as a problem will start to go away. Good gang management also involves the consideration that gang members in some instances and in some locales may be routinely armed. It's not unusual at all that gang members are armed for purposes of conflict with other gang members or for purposes of criminal activity. Quite frequently, gang members will have a younger person in their company who is asked to carry the weapon. The reason for that is that carrying a weapon for a juvenile is less of an offense, less of a penalty than it is for the adult gang member.
Unfortunately, most of them live in the area, go to school in the area, shop in the area, entertain themselves in the area, and they're easily recognized by the groups that we deal with here on a negative basis in some cases, and they get a lot of threats that they're going to come back and do bodily harm of one sort or another. Most of it is bluff, but when they're off duty, there have been cases my officers have been jumped, recognized offside, so they take those threats seriously.
Good gang management also involves, as we discussed, careful and consistent communication with local law enforcement. If that communication is to occur, the channels of communication need to be opened early. Be frank. Discuss the problems that you're having. Ask them to be equally frank. Ask them to discuss with you any intelligence information they might have that would be the cause for your alarm or extra care. For example, if they know that a gang member is armed, a particular gang member, or that gang members are routinely armed in your area, that's a piece of information that security would need to have. If they have other information about a wave or possible group of criminal activity, and you have a facility that might be a victim, that's also information that would be well to have.
Okay, you guys on the other side. Thank you.
We talked about juveniles originally. We said that juveniles, for purposes of this discussion, are those who behave in a juvenile way, in essence. We also said that juvenile behavior, which might be acceptable in another setting, might not be acceptable in the mall setting. We said that congregating is permissible perhaps in a high school corridor, but not in a shopping mall corridor. Juveniles should be treated as patrons. Juveniles spend a lot of money on retail properties. The fact that they spend money should not alter security's approach to juvenile activities. Please remember that more patrons are sometimes dissuaded from shopping at a particular property by a congregation of juveniles. The owner of the property has a perfectly legitimate interest in controlling juvenile activity up to the point of banning individuals who refuse to comply with mall rules. The management of juveniles and gangs is a process that goes on. Juvenile problems are not solved, and I suspect are not going to be solved in this generation or perhaps the next. Juvenile problems for mall security is something that takes constant vigilance. It takes being informed. It takes putting effort into training officers to react appropriately. It means pre-planning activities. There are a lot of facets to managing juveniles, and I hope that today's program has been informative and will help you in managing juveniles and gangs on your property.